Perhaps someone from Louisiana wouldn't understand the complexities of sophisticated financial markets. Nancy Pelosi said it with a condescending smile, certain she had just demolished Senator John Kennedy in front of millions of C-SPAN viewers. This isn't some backwater courthouse senator. This is the United States Congress where serious people discuss serious matters. But Kennedy didn't flinch, didn't get defensive. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and smiled, the smile of a man who had just watched his opponent dig her own grave. "You mentioned constitutional law." Kennedy said, his Louisiana drawl slow as honey over broken glass. "I did pick up a thing or two about it during my time at Oxford University." Oxford, first-class honors, not exactly the resume of a small-town lawyer, and inside the worn leather briefcase sitting beside his chair were folders containing stock trading records, financial reports, and evidence about the question that folks back home in Louisiana wanted answered. How exactly does a public servant on a $174,000 salary accumulate a personal net worth of $315 million? Nancy Pelosi had just called one of Oxford's trained constitutional scholars a backwater lawyer. She was about to learn the most expensive lesson of her life about underestimating a Southern gentleman. What happened over the next 4 hours would dismantle not just Pelosi's reputation, but an empire built on decades of insider trades campaign finance schemes and a two-tiered justice system that protected the powerful while punishing ordinary Americans. This is that story. The Senate Banking Committee hearing room crackled with electric tension as C-SPAN cameras rolled live to millions of Americans hungry for accountability. What they were about to witness would become the most-watched congressional hearing since Watergate, but unlike Watergate, this destruction would be delivered with a Louisiana drawl and surgical precision. Senator John Kennedy entered the chamber with the quiet confidence of a constitutional scholar who had spent months preparing for this moment. His weathered leather briefcase contained enough evidence to end political careers, but his unassuming demeanor, simple gray suit, wire-rimmed glasses, and that unmistakable Southern bearing stood in stark contrast to the explosive nature of what he was about to unleash. Nancy Pelosi swept into the chamber like she owned it, which in many ways she felt she did. After decades of wielding power in Washington, she carried herself with the imperial bearing of someone accustomed to crushing opposition through sheer force of political will. Her expensive suit, perfectly coiffed hair, and entourage of high-priced attorneys sent a clear message she was here to destroy this upstart senator from Louisiana. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chairman Tim Scott announced, as the room fell into anticipatory silence, "we're here for oversight hearings on ethics violations and financial misconduct in Congress. Today, the American people get the accountability they've been demanding." Pelosi immediately seized the initiative, her voice dripping with San Francisco superiority and barely concealed contempt. "Senator Kennedy, with all due respect to your colorful background," she began, her pause deliberate and calculated. Perhaps someone from Louisiana wouldn't understand the complexities of sophisticated financial markets. The liberal reporters in the gallery nodded approvingly, their pen ready to chronicle what they expected would be Pelosi's intellectual demolition of a simple Southern politician. "I've been dealing with complex policy matters while you were still learning constitutional law." Pelosi continued, her voice gaining confidence with each condescending word. "Maybe you should stick to what you know, simple Louisiana politics and folksy sayings." She gestured dismissively at Kennedy's modest appearance. "This isn't some backwater courthouse senator. This is the United States Congress where serious people discuss serious matters." The gallery supporters smirked openly at Kennedy's expense. This was exactly the kind of coastal elite superiority they loved to see deployed against conservative politicians. Pelosi was performing perfectly for her audience. But Kennedy sat quietly in his chair, that patient Southern smile never wavering. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses slowly, completely unruffled by the attack. His demeanor was that of a man who had heard far worse from far better. "Well now, Madam Speaker," Kennedy began, his Louisiana drawl carrying across the chamber like honey over broken glass. That's mighty gracious of you to share your thoughts on my background. He paused, letting the moment build with the timing of a master storyteller. I do appreciate you bringing up constitutional law, though. You see, I did pick up a thing or two about it during my time at Oxford University. The chamber's atmosphere shifted perceptibly as Kennedy's words sank in. Oxford University. Not exactly the resume of a simple country lawyer. First-class honors in jurisprudence if we're comparing educational credentials, Kennedy continued with devastating politeness. But I reckon what matters ain't where you went to school. It's whether you follow the law when you get there. Pelosi's smugness evaporated in real time as she realized she had just walked into a trap of her own making. The man she had tried to dismiss as an intellectual lightweight had just revealed himself to be an Oxford-educated constitutional scholar with a perfect command of both legal precedent and political theater. Now then, Kennedy said, reaching for his briefcase with theatrical slowness, about that simple question that's been troubling folks back home in Louisiana. His eyes met Pelosi's across the chamber. How exactly does a public servant on a $174,000 salary accumulate a personal net worth of $315 million? The briefcase opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent chamber like the sound of a political coffin being nailed shut. The destruction was about to begin. Kennedy opened his first folder with deliberate precision, the sound of rustling papers echoing through the suddenly silent chamber like the opening notes of a political funeral march. The folder was thick-bound with Securities and Exchange Commission seals that seemed to pulse with financial significance. "Madam Speaker," he began, his Louisiana drawl carrying across the room with new authority, "you mentioned sophisticated financial markets. Well, let's talk about just how sophisticated your family's trading has been." Pelosi straightened in her chair, attempting to project the confidence that had just been shattered by Kennedy's educational revelation. "Senator Kennedy," she replied, her voice lacking its earlier smugness, "my family's investments are fully disclosed and completely legal. We've always followed all applicable laws and regulations." "Well, now, that's mighty interesting," Kennedy said, his eyes twinkling with the anticipation of a prosecutor who just felt a massive tug on his legal fishing line. "Because I got some documents here that might shed new light on that legal part." Pelosi's media-trained instincts kicked in as she prepared to deploy her well-rehearsed talking points about transparency and legal compliance. This was familiar territory, the standard defense she'd used countless times when questioned about her family's remarkable investment success. "Senator Kennedy, my husband and I have always made our financial disclosures public as required by law." She began, her voice gaining strength with each familiar word. "Every transaction is properly reported to the appropriate authorities. We've never engaged in any illegal trading activities." She gestured with practiced confidence, her tone taking on the condescending quality of a professor addressing particularly slow students. "What you're seeing is simply the result of good investment advice and careful financial planning over many decades of public service." Several progressive activists in the gallery nodded supportively. CNN's cameras captured their approving expressions. This was the Nancy Pelosi they expected, articulate, unflappable, completely in control of her narrative. But Kennedy sat quietly, occasionally making notes on his legal pad with the unhurried precision of someone who knew exactly where this conversation was heading. His patient Southern smile never wavered, and somehow that made Pelosi's confident performance seem less convincing to everyone watching. "Well, Madam Speaker," Kennedy said, reaching into his briefcase with the theatrical slowness of a magician about to perform his greatest trick, "I sure do appreciate that inspiring story about legal compliance and careful planning, but you know what, I'm a lawyer and lawyers like timelines. And I got some timelines here that tell a mighty different story." He pulled out a thick stack of official papers, each bearing various government seals and financial institution stamps. The documents were arranged with prosecutorial precision, each one a piece of evidence in what was becoming clear was a comprehensive case against one of America's most powerful politicians. These here are trading records from your husband's brokerage accounts cross-referenced with your committee meeting schedules and classified briefing calendars. Kennedy explained, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone who had spent months building an airtight case. He held up the first document, a Visa trading record that would soon become famous across America. Let's start with a little company called Visa, Madam Speaker. I'm sure you remember them. Kennedy displayed the document on the chamber's monitors, pointing to specific dates with a laser pointer. March 18, 2008. You attended a classified briefing about pending credit card legislation that would significantly impact Visa's business model. The timeline was displayed with devastating clarity. March 19, 2008, exactly 1 day after your classified briefing, your husband Paul purchased 5,000 shares of Visa at the IPO price of $44 per share. Kennedy paused, letting the implications sink into the consciousness of everyone in the chamber. March 21, 2008, 2 days after your husband's purchase, Visa stock jumped to $64 per share. That's a 45% gain in just 2 days, Madam Speaker. The mathematical precision was stunning. But here's the really interesting part, Kennedy continued with devastating gentleness. That credit card legislation you were briefed about, the legislation that would have hurt Visa's profits, it mysteriously died in committee and never came up for a vote. Pelosi's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face went slightly pale, but she tried to maintain her composure through sheer force of will. Senator Kennedy, that's nothing more than coincidental timing. My husband makes investment decisions based on publicly available information. Kennedy wasn't finished. He moved to a large presentation board that had been wheeled into the chamber during the brief recess. Coincidental timing, you say? Well, let's talk about patterns, Madam Speaker. The board displayed a comprehensive chart showing 47 separate trading transactions by Paul Pelosi, each one correlated with Nancy Pelosi's committee activities and classified briefings. The pattern was so blatant, so systematic, that even Pelosi's media allies in the gallery began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Over the past 5 years, your husband has executed 47 stock trades with a combined profit of over $50 million. Kennedy explained, his voice rising with moral indignation. Every single one of these trades was preceded by classified briefings about the relevant industry sectors. He pointed to specific examples with his laser pointer. Tesla stock purchased 2 days before a classified briefing about electric vehicle subsidies. Amazon options purchased 3 days before a classified briefing about government contract awards. Microsoft shares purchased 1 week before a classified briefing about cloud computing security requirements. Kennedy's voice became more pointed. The probability of this level of success through random chance, according to statistical analysis conducted by Georgetown University's mathematics department, is approximately 1 in 847 billion. He turned to face Pelosi directly. Madam Speaker, you're either the greatest investor in human history or something else entirely. Just as Pelosi was preparing her defense, Kennedy gestured toward the chamber's rear entrance. Now I know this is getting complicated, so I brought someone to help explain it to the American people. The doors opened and a distinguished man in a conservative suit entered under security escort. His bearing immediately identified him as a career government official, someone who had spent decades investigating financial crimes with meticulous precision. Ladies and gentlemen, Kennedy announced, I'd like you to meet Mr. James Patterson, former senior investigator with the Securities and Exchange Commission, who spent 30 years investigating insider trading cases. Pelosi's horror was complete. Patterson was supposed to be retired, living quietly in Florida. How had Kennedy found him? How had he convinced a career civil servant to break decades of protocol and testify against one of the most powerful politicians in America? Patterson took his seat at the witness table, adjusting the microphone with hands that carried the steadiness of a man who had spent his career pursuing financial criminals regardless of their political connections. Mr. Patterson, Kennedy began with respectful formality, in your 30 years of investigating insider trading, have you ever seen a pattern of trading success like the Pelosi family's? Patterson's response was immediate and devastating. Never, Senator Kennedy. In 3 decades of investigating sophisticated financial crimes, I have never encountered a pattern of trading that was so obviously based on material, non-public information. His voice carried the weight of professional expertise earned through thousands of investigations. This isn't investing, Senator. This is systematic exploitation of classified government information for personal financial gain. In simpler terms, it's legalized theft from the American people. Kennedy leaned forward. Mr. Patterson, if this pattern of trading were conducted by a private citizen without access to classified information, what would be the appropriate legal response? Criminal prosecution for securities fraud with potential penalties of up to 20 years in federal prison and complete forfeiture of all profits gained through illegal trading. Patterson replied without hesitation. Kennedy wasn't finished. He reached for another folder, this one marked with the recent dates that made Pelosi's face go completely white. But let's talk about something more recent, Madam Speaker, Kennedy said, his tone becoming more prosecutorial. November 2024, your husband purchased $2 million worth of call options on NVIDIA stock. The timing chart he displayed was damning beyond belief. These options were purchased just days before you voted to support the CHIPS and Science Act legislation that would directly benefit NVIDIA and other semiconductor companies. Kennedy's voice rose with righteous anger. But here's the really interesting part about timing and disclosure, Madam Speaker. You filed the required disclosure for this trade on Friday afternoon before Christmas weekend. He turned to address the cameras directly. Ladies and gentlemen, she deliberately timed this disclosure to minimize media coverage, hoping Americans would be too busy with their families to notice that she had just made another fortune trading on government information. Kennedy's final words for this round carried the weight of constitutional authority. This isn't just insider trading, Madam Speaker. This is a systematic conspiracy to defraud the American people using the power of your congressional office. The first round was over. Kennedy had systematically destroyed Pelosi's claims of legal compliance with official documents, expert testimony, and mathematical evidence that demonstrated a level of corruption so brazen it defied belief. But Kennedy's expression as he reached for his second folder suggested that somehow impossibly the violations were about to get much worse. Round one's done, Madam Speaker, he said with terrifying Southern charm. But we got a lot more constitutional dancing to do before this song's over. The 15-minute recess felt like an eternity for Nancy Pelosi. She sat in a side room, her expensive attorneys huddled around her like doctors around a terminal patient. The confidence that had carried her through decades of political battles was evaporating like morning dew under the Louisiana sun. Madam Speaker, her lead attorney whispered urgently, Kennedy clearly has access to records we didn't know existed. We need to consider damage control options. Absolutely not, Pelosi hissed, though her voice lacked its usual authority. This is political theater designed to destroy a successful woman. I can handle some Louisiana lawyer with delusions of grandeur. But deep down, Pelosi knew something fundamental had changed. The trading documents, the expert testimony, the mathematical impossibility of her family's success. It was all too precise, too devastating. Kennedy hadn't stumbled onto this information. He'd been building a comprehensive case with the methodical precision of a constitutional scholar who never left anything to chance. When the hearing reconvened, Kennedy sat calmly at his table, a new folder placed prominently in front of him. This one was thicker than the first, bound with Federal Election Commission seals and bank records that seemed to pulse with criminal significance. Senator Kennedy, Chairman Scott announced, "You may continue with your presentation." Kennedy stood slowly, his movements deliberate and predatory like a constitutional scholar who had found the perfect test case for everything wrong with Washington corruption. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, Madam Speaker, he said, turning to face Pelosi directly, let's talk about how your family has been converting taxpayer resources into personal wealth through what I can only describe as the most sophisticated money laundering operation in congressional history. Kennedy opened the folder with ceremonial precision, revealing stacks of bank records, campaign finance reports, and Federal Election Commission filings that told a story of systematic corruption spanning multiple election cycles. Madam Speaker, your congressional salary is $174,000 per year. Kennedy began his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent months following money trails through the labyrinth of Washington financial structures. But somehow your husband Tim Manette's consulting firm has received approximately $2.8 million from your various campaigns and associated political action committees over the past 4 years. The numbers were displayed on the chamber's monitors with devastating clarity. Each transaction was detailed with dates, amounts, and alleged purposes that would soon be revealed as elaborate fiction. Now, I ain't a mathematician, Kennedy continued with that deceptive Southern humility, but $2.8 million is more than 16 times your annual congressional salary flowing directly to your family business accounts. Pelosi's defense was immediate and desperate. Senator Kennedy consulting services are a legitimate campaign expense. Travel coordination, fundraising assistance, and strategic communications are necessary functions for any competitive political operation. Is that so? Kennedy asked his Texas drawl, carrying new menace. Well, that's real interesting because I got some travel records here that might shed new light on what kind of consulting your family was actually providing to your campaigns. Kennedy produced a comprehensive collection of travel receipts, hotel bills, and expense reports that painted a picture of systematic campaign finance fraud conducted with breathtaking audacity. Between March 2019 and November 2020, your campaigns paid your family's consulting firm $230,000 for what you described as travel consulting services. Kennedy read from the official campaign finance reports. But these receipts tell a very different story about where that money actually went. He continued displaying the actual travel documentation side by side with the campaign expense reports. The contrast was devastating. Campaign reports showed payments for official campaign strategy meetings and voter outreach coordination. But the actual receipts showed luxury resort stays, first-class international flights, and five-star hotel accommodations that had nothing to do with political activity. Luxury resorts in Bermuda, first-class flights to Paris, five-star hotels in Rome, Kennedy read with prosecutorial precision. Now, I might be a simple Louisiana lawyer, but I'm having trouble understanding how a vacation in Bermuda constitutes campaign strategy for a California congressional race. Pelosi's panic was becoming visible to everyone in the chamber. Her hand shook as she shuffled through prepared responses that suddenly seemed completely inadequate. Those were legitimate strategy retreats. Political campaigns require private settings to discuss sensitive matters. Kennedy's eyebrows raised with theatrical skepticism that would soon become a viral meme. Strategy retreats in Bermuda for a San Francisco congressional seat that you've held for over 30 years? Kennedy moved to a sophisticated digital display system that had been set up during the recess. But here's where it gets really interesting from a legal perspective, Madam Speaker. I got bank records here that show the exact timing of these consulting payments and how they were immediately converted into personal luxury expenses. The split-screen display was devastating in its precision. On the left side showed campaign expenditure reports listing payments to consulting firms. On the right side showed credit card charges for personal luxury items occurring within hours of the campaign payments. March 15, 2019, 2:47 p.m. Your campaign pays $50,000 to Minette Consulting for strategic communication services. Kennedy read from the bank records. March 15, 2019, 3:24 p.m. Credit card linked to Minette Consulting books a $15,000 romantic weekend getaway at a luxury resort in Miami. The timing was impossibly precise and undeniably corrupt. Your campaign paid for consulting services at 2:47 p.m. Your family booked a luxury vacation at 3:24 p.m. the same day using campaign money. Kennedy's voice rose with moral indignation. That ain't consulting, Madam Speaker. That's campaign finance fraud with a timestamp. Kennedy opened his final section for this round, revealing documents marked with official Federal Election Commission seals and criminal referral stamps that indicated this investigation had reached the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Madam Speaker, Kennedy said, his voice taking on the tone of a constitutional professor delivering a lesson in criminal law. Let me explain what your family has done in legal terms that every American can understand. He moved to a whiteboard that had been set up for the hearing and began writing charges with the precision of someone who had spent months consulting with federal prosecutors. Campaign finance fraud, personal use of campaign funds, filing false Federal Election Commission reports, wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to defraud the United States. Each charge was written clearly with corresponding federal statute numbers and penalty ranges that demonstrated the scope of potential criminal liability. That's 6 federal felonies, Madam Speaker, each carrying penalties ranging from 5 to 20 years in federal prison and complete forfeiture of all assets obtained through criminal activity. Kennedy turned to face Pelosi directly, his voice carrying ultimate constitutional authority. But here's what really offends me about your financial crimes, Madam Speaker. While you were using campaign money to fund your family's luxury lifestyle, there were legitimate candidates across America who couldn't afford to run for office because they were actually following the law. His voice rose with constitutional indignation that would be replayed millions of times across social media. You stole from your own supporters. People sent you $5 and $10 donations thinking they were supporting political causes, and you spent their money on luxury vacations and family business ventures. Nay. Kennedy produced one final revelation for this round, displaying a complex organizational chart that showed the true scope of the Pelosi family's political money laundering operation. But the campaign finance violations are just the beginning. Madam Speaker, Kennedy said, his tone becoming more serious. Your family has established a network of businesses, trusts, and political organizations that have received over $15 million in questionable payments over the past decade. The financial web was staggering in its complexity and criminal sophistication. Real estate investments made with insider knowledge of government development projects, family members receiving no-show government consulting contracts, a network of political organizations that existed primarily to funnel money between various Pelosi family business interests. Madam Speaker, Kennedy said with devastating finality, you haven't just violated campaign finance law. You've turned your congressional office into the headquarters of a criminal enterprise designed to enrich your family at the expense of American taxpayers and political donors. The second round was over. Kennedy had systematically exposed Pelosi's financial corruption with bank records, Federal Election Commission violations, and evidence of a money laundering conspiracy that reached far beyond simple campaign finance abuse. But as he reached for his third folder marked with law enforcement seals and legal documents bearing the signature of federal prosecutors, his expression suggested that the financial crimes were merely preparation for something that threatened the very foundations of equal justice in America. Round two's done, Madam Speaker, he said with that terrifying Southern calm. But now we need to talk about how your family used political power to escape accountability for crimes that would send ordinary Americans to prison for decades. If Nancy Pelosi thought the financial corruption revelations were devastating, she was about to learn that John Kennedy was just getting warmed up. The constitutional scholar from Texas reached for his third folder, this one bearing law enforcement seals and court documents that seemed to pulse with the weight of a two-tiered justice system that was about to be exposed to the harsh light of constitutional scrutiny. Madam Speaker, Kennedy began, his voice carrying new gravitas. If you think corruption is just about money, you're about to learn how political power corrupts the very foundation of equal justice under law. Pelosi's remaining attorneys were frantically whispering damage control strategies, but she seemed unable to hear them. Her eyes were fixed on Kennedy with the intensity of someone watching her own political execution being carried out with surgical precision. Kennedy stood and moved to a timeline display that had been set up during the brief recess. Now, Madam Speaker, let's talk about the evening of May 28, 2022, when your family's sense of privilege and entitlement collided with the criminal justice system. He began displaying a minute-by-minute reconstruction of events that would soon become one of the most analyzed DUI cases in American legal history. 10:26 p.m., May 28, 2022. Kennedy read with the precision of someone who had studied every police report and witness statement. Your husband, Paul Pelosi, driving a 2021 Porsche Carrera worth more than most Americans make in 3 years, collided with a 2014 Jeep in Napa County wine country. The police reports were displayed on the monitors, each detail contributing to a pattern of privilege and special treatment that would shock Americans across the political spectrum. Blood alcohol content 0.082%, which is above the legal limit of 0.08%, Kennedy continued. California Highway Patrol officers reported that your husband was unsteady on his feet, his speech was slurred, and he had a strong odor of alcoholic beverage. Kennedy's voice took on the tone of someone who had spent his career defending constitutional principles against political corruption. But here's where it gets interesting from a justice perspective, Madam Speaker. Watch what happened next. Kennedy displayed a series of booking photos and arrest records that told the story of a justice system that operated differently for the politically connected. Your husband was arrested at 11:44 p.m. and booked into Napa County Jail at 4:13 a.m., Kennedy explained. Normal processing time for a DUI arrest is approximately 30 minutes. Your husband's processing took 4 hours and 29 minutes. The delay was documented with meticulous precision. Why the delay? According to internal police communications obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, officers spent over 4 hours discussing how to handle what they termed a high-profile suspect. Kennedy produced the actual police communications redacted, but clearly showing the special consideration given to Paul Pelosi's case. These communications show officers consulting with supervisors, county attorneys, and ultimately state-level officials about how to handle the arrest of the Speaker of the House's husband. The implications were staggering. Madam Speaker, your husband received a level of consideration and consultation that is never provided to ordinary Americans facing identical charges. Kennedy moved to a comprehensive comparison chart showing how Paul Pelosi's case was handled versus typical DUI prosecutions in California. Let's talk about consequences, Madam Speaker, Kennedy said, his voice rising with moral indignation. Your husband was released on $5,000 bail, which is significantly lower than the standard $10,000 bail for DUI with injury cases in Napa County. The bail comparison was damning. More importantly, California law requires DUI defendants to appear personally in court unless specifically waived by the judge. Your husband never appeared in court once during his entire prosecution. Kennedy's voice became cutting. While working-class Americans charged with identical crimes had to take time off work, arrange childcare, and appear in court multiple times, your husband was allowed to have his attorney handle everything while he remained comfortable at your multi-million-dollar Napa Valley estate. The legal proceedings chart showed a pattern of special treatment that violated every principle of equal justice. August 23, 2022, your husband pleaded guilty to DUI causing injury through his attorney, sentenced 5 days in jail, 3 years probation, and approximately $7,000 in fines. Kennedy turned to face the chamber. But here's the really outrageous part. He received credit for 2 days, already served credit for 2 more days based on good conduct, and was allowed to serve the remaining day through a court work program. Kennedy produced evidence of a coordinated media management campaign that demonstrated how political power was used to minimize accountability and public scrutiny. While your husband was being arrested for drunk driving, you were in Rhode Island delivering a commencement address at Brown University, Kennedy noted. But within hours of his arrest, a sophisticated damage control operation was activated. The timeline showed communications between Pelosi's office media contacts and political allies designed to minimize coverage and deflect criticism. Your office immediately began framing this as a personal matter while simultaneously coordinating with friendly media outlets to downplay the severity of driving under the influence, Kennedy explained. He displayed email communications showing the coordination. These emails show your staff working with sympathetic journalists to emphasize that no one was seriously injured while ignoring the fact that your husband could have killed innocent people through his selfish decision to drive while intoxicated. Kennedy opened a final section that placed the DUI incident in the context of a broader pattern of accountability avoidance that had characterized the Pelosi family's relationship with law enforcement for decades. But this DUI cover-up isn't an isolated incident, Madam Speaker. Kennedy said, his voice taking on the authority of someone who had uncovered systematic abuse of power. This is part of a pattern of using political influence to shield your family from the consequences that ordinary Americans would face. He displayed a comprehensive timeline showing multiple incidents where the Pelosi family had received special treatment from law enforcement and the justice system. Traffic violations dismissed without explanation, building code violations ignored by city inspectors, business license irregularities overlooked by regulatory authorities. Kennedy read from the documented pattern. Every time your family encountered the law, political influence materialized to make problems disappear, Kennedy continued. This DUI case just happened to be too public and too serious to completely hide from scrutiny. Kennedy's voice reached a crescendo of constitutional indignation. Madam Speaker, you and your family have spent decades demonstrating contempt for the legal system that governs ordinary Americans. You've used political power to create a bubble of privilege where laws are suggestions and consequences are for other people. Kennedy moved to his final presentation for this round, holding a photograph of a young mother whose life had been destroyed by a drunk driver. This is Maria Rodriguez. Kennedy said, his voice heavy with moral weight. She was killed by a drunk driver in San Antonio 3 weeks before your husband's DUI arrest. The driver who killed her had a blood alcohol content of 0.085%, just barely higher than your husband's 0.082%. The personal story made the abstract legal issues devastatingly concrete. Maria's killer was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Your husband served less than 1 day and was allowed to complete his sentence through community service. Kennedy's final words for this round carried ultimate constitutional authority. The difference between Maria's killer and your husband wasn't the severity of their crimes or the danger they posed to innocent people. The difference was political power and the corruption of a justice system that treats the politically connected as above the law. The third round was over. Kennedy had systematically exposed how the Pelosi family used political influence to escape accountability for criminal behavior that would have destroyed ordinary Americans. But as he reached for his fourth folder marked with congressional seals and constitutional law citations, his expression suggested that the abuse of legal privilege was merely preparation for the ultimate betrayal of the oath of office. Round three's done, Madam Speaker, he said with terrifying constitutional calm. But now we need to talk about the oath you swore to uphold the Constitution and how you've systematically violated every principle it represents. The chamber had taken on the atmosphere of a constitutional tribunal where the very foundations of American representative government were being defended against decades of systematic abuse. Nancy Pelosi sat like a broken statue, her designer suit wrinkled with perspiration, her eyes vacant and staring at some internal sanctuary where the mounting evidence of her constitutional violations couldn't reach her. But Kennedy wasn't finished. The Texas constitutional scholar reached for his fourth folder marked with congressional seals and constitutional law citations that seemed to pulse with the weight of founding principles that had been betrayed by the very people sworn to defend them. Madam Speaker, Kennedy began, his voice carrying the sacred authority of someone defending the Constitution against domestic enemies. Everything we've discussed today, the insider trading, the financial corruption, the abuse of legal privilege, all of it pales in comparison to what we're about to discuss. Kennedy's eyes bore into Pelosi with the intensity of a constitutional scholar seeking justice for the highest crimes against representative government. We're about to talk about your oath of office. We're about to talk about the systematic betrayal of every principle this republic was founded upon. Kennedy stood and moved to the center of the chamber, holding a worn copy of the Constitution in his hands like a sacred text that had been defiled by political corruption. Madam Speaker, do you remember the oath you took when you were sworn into Congress? Kennedy asked, his Louisiana drawl making the words sound like a prayer for a constitutional redemption. Pelosi's voice was barely audible, reduced to a whisper by the weight of accumulated evidence. Yes, I took the congressional oath. The congressional oath. Kennedy repeated, his voice carrying the weight of constitutional traditions spanning over 2 centuries. Let me remind you what you swore before Almighty God and the American people. Kennedy began reciting from memory, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent his career studying the founding documents. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. He paused, letting the words sink into the consciousness of everyone in the chamber and the millions watching across America. True faith and allegiance, Madam Speaker, not to your bank account, not to your family business interests, not to your political party, to the Constitution of the United States. Kennedy opened his folder and began displaying evidence that would transform this hearing from a political scandal into a constitutional crisis. But you didn't just break that oath, Madam Speaker, you systematically violated every principle it represents. Kennedy produced documents marked with House Judiciary Committee seals that told the story of how constitutional processes had been weaponized for political destruction. Let's talk about impeachment, Madam Speaker. Kennedy said, his voice taking on the tone of a constitutional professor delivering a lecture on the abuse of power. The Constitution provides for impeachment as a remedy for high crimes and misdemeanors, serious offenses against the state that threaten the constitutional order. The timeline he displayed showed a different story, impeachment used as a political weapon rather than a constitutional remedy. December 18, 2019. You orchestrated the first impeachment of President Trump based on a phone call where he asked about investigating potential corruption, Kennedy explained. But the evidence we've presented today shows that you were simultaneously engaged in corruption that made Trump's alleged offenses look like jaywalking. Kennedy's voice rose with constitutional indignation. You used the ultimate constitutional remedy while you were violating your own constitutional oath through systematic financial corruption. You weaponized impeachment while you were betraying the very Constitution you claimed to defend. The irony was devastating and undeniable. You accused President Trump of abuse of power while you were using your congressional office to enrich your family through insider trading and campaign finance fraud. Kennedy moved to evidence showing how Pelosi had corrupted the congressional oversight process to serve partisan political objectives rather than constitutional accountability. The January 6th committee, Madam Speaker, Kennedy said, displaying communications that showed the political calculation behind what was presented as constitutional investigation. You claimed this committee was about defending democracy and constitutional governance. The internal communications told a different story. But these emails between your office and committee staff show that the primary objective was political destruction of Republican opponents rather than constitutional accountability. Kennedy displayed evidence of selective presentation of evidence, denial of Republican witness requests, and coordination with media allies to maximize political damage rather than pursue constitutional truth. You denied Republicans the right to call witnesses, you selectively edited evidence to support predetermined conclusions, and you coordinated with media outlets to ensure maximum political impact. Kennedy said, his voice carrying prosecutorial authority. That's not constitutional oversight, Madam Speaker. That's political theater designed to destroy your opponents while you were engaging in the very corruption you claim to be investigating. Kennedy opened another section revealing how Pelosi had systematically abused congressional resources for personal and family benefit in violation of federal law and constitutional principles. Let's talk about how you've used taxpayer resources, Madam Speaker. Kennedy said, displaying expense reports and travel records that painted a picture of systematic abuse spanning multiple congressional terms. Congressional travel budgets used for family business meetings, staff time spent coordinating your husband's investment portfolio, office resources used to coordinate with family business interests. Kennedy read from the documented violations. The pattern was comprehensive and undeniable. Over the past decade, American taxpayers have subsidized your family's business operations to the tune of approximately $2.3 million in congressional resources used for non-official purposes. Kennedy's voice became cutting. While American families struggle with inflation and economic hardship, you've been using their tax dollars to support your family's multi-million-dollar business empire. Kennedy moved to his final presentation for this round, creating a comprehensive summary of constitutional violations that demonstrated a pattern of systematic corruption spanning decades. Let me summarize what we've documented today from a constitutional perspective, Kennedy said, moving to a whiteboard where he began listing violations with the precision of someone who had spent months consulting with constitutional scholars and federal prosecutors. Violation of oath of office, abuse of congressional privilege, misuse of taxpayer resources, obstruction of constitutional processes, weaponization of impeachment power, corruption of congressional oversight. Each violation was accompanied by specific evidence, constitutional citations, and precedents that demonstrated the scope of Pelosi's betrayal of her sworn duties. "This isn't political disagreement, Madam Speaker," Kennedy said, his voice carrying ultimate constitutional authority. "This is systematic criminal activity designed to corrupt American representative government for personal benefit." Kennedy's voice reached a crescendo of constitutional indignation that would be replayed millions of times across social media and conservative outlets. "You swore to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But you became the enemy. You became exactly what the founders feared most, a corrupt politician using constitutional processes to enrich yourself while destroying the very institutions you were sworn to protect." The fourth round was over. Kennedy had systematically exposed Pelosi's betrayal of her constitutional oath with documented evidence, legal analysis, and moral authority that demonstrated systematic corruption of the highest offices in American government. But as he reached for his final folder, the expression on his face suggested that even constitutional betrayal was merely preparation for the ultimate confrontation between constitutional principles and political corruption. "Round four's done, Madam Speaker," he said with terrifying constitutional calm. "But now we need to have the final conversation about accountability consequences and what happens when constitutional justice finally catches up with decades of political corruption." The hearing room had transcended political theater and become something approaching a moment of constitutional reckoning. Nancy Pelosi sat motionless, her mind seemingly retreated to some internal sanctuary where the mounting evidence of her systematic corruption couldn't reach her. The woman who had wielded power with an iron fist for decades had been reduced to a hollow shell by the methodical constitutional destruction delivered by a Louisiana lawyer with an Oxford education and an unshakable commitment to constitutional principles. But Kennedy wasn't finished. The constitutional scholar from Texas stood for his final presentation, holding both his pocket constitution and the complete evidence of systematic corruption that would end one of the most powerful political careers in American history. "Madam Speaker," Kennedy began, his voice carrying the sacred authority of someone delivering constitutional justice after decades of corruption had gone unpunished. "We've covered a lot of ground today. Insider trading that would make Wall Street criminals blush. Financial corruption that turned your congressional office into a family ATM machine. Legal privilege that created a two-tiered justice system. Constitutional violations that betrayed every principle this republic was founded upon." Kennedy's eyes bore into Pelosi with the intensity of a constitutional scholar who had spent months building an airtight case against political corruption. "But now we need to talk about the ultimate question that every American is asking. What happens next? What are the consequences when someone systematically betrays their oath of office and steals from the American people for decades?" Pelosi summoned what remained of her political instincts for one final desperate attempt to destroy her tormentor through personal attack rather than address the overwhelming evidence of her corruption. "Senator Kennedy," she began, her voice shaking with desperation and barely controlled rage, "you're just a backwards politician from a backwards state trying to destroy a strong woman who has dedicated her life to public service." Her voice gained strength as she fell back on the identity politics playbook that had served her throughout her career. "This entire hearing is nothing but sexist, elitist persecution designed to silence progressive voices and maintain the power of conservative white men who can't stand seeing women in positions of authority." She gestured wildly, her composure completely shattered. "You don't understand modern politics or progressive values. You represent everything that's wrong with American politics: ignorance, prejudice, and the systematic oppression of anyone who dares to challenge conservative orthodoxy." The liberal reporters in the gallery began taking notes furiously, hoping that Pelosi's personal attack might somehow shift the narrative away from the devastating evidence that had been presented. I've spent my entire career fighting for working families, for women's rights, for social justice. Pelosi continued, her voice becoming more shrill with each word. And you're trying to destroy me because you can't handle the idea of a powerful woman from San Francisco showing you how government really works. Kennedy waited patiently for Pelosi's tantrum to end, his Southern gentleman demeanor never wavering even in the face of desperate personal attacks. When she finally finished, he adjusted his glasses with the calm precision of someone who had just watched his opponent's complete political suicide. "Well, Madam Speaker," Kennedy began, his Louisiana drawl carrying new authority, "I appreciate you sharing your thoughts on my character and my motivations. But you know what? This ain't about me. This ain't about your gender, your politics, or your zip code." His voice began to rise with the moral authority of someone defending constitutional principles against systematic corruption. "This is about your oath of office. This is about your systematic betrayal of the American people who trusted you with their most sacred institutions." Kennedy moved closer to Pelosi, his voice carrying the weight of constitutional judgment. "I understand corruption just fine, Madam Speaker. I understand what happens when power corrupts absolutely, and I understand what the Constitution requires us to do when government officials betray their sworn duties." His voice became cutting with moral precision. "You want to talk about fighting for working families? Let's talk about the working families whose $5 and $10 campaign contributions you spent on luxury vacations. You want to talk about women's rights? Let's talk about the women who couldn't afford to run for office because they were actually following campaign finance laws while you were breaking them to fund your family business." Kennedy's voice reached a crescendo of constitutional indignation. "And you want to talk about social justice? Let's talk about the justice that says no one, absolutely no one, is above the law regardless of their political power or their sense of personal entitlement." Kennedy moved to a massive presentation board that had been prepared for this final moment, a comprehensive visual summary of every piece of evidence presented during the hearing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kennedy announced, addressing both the chamber and the millions of Americans watching, "what we have documented here today represents the most systematic abuse of congressional power in modern American history." The board displayed a timeline spanning from 2007 to 2024, showing the progression of Pelosi's corruption from simple trading advantages to systematic financial fraud to constitutional violations that threaten the very foundations of representative government. $50 million in insider trading profits based on classified government information, Kennedy read from the evidence summary. $15 million in campaign finance violations and money laundering through family business networks. Systematic abuse of legal privilege to escape accountability for criminal behavior. Complete corruption of constitutional processes for personal and political benefit. Kennedy's voice carried the weight of someone who had spent months building a case that would transform American understanding of political corruption. This isn't about political disagreement or policy differences. This is about systematic criminal activity conducted by someone who swore an oath to serve the American people. Kennedy moved to his final presentation, holding photographs of ordinary Americans whose lives had been affected by the kind of corruption Pelosi represented. "I want to show you some people, Madam Speaker," Kennedy said, displaying images of families, workers, and small business owners who represented the Americans that congressional corruption betrayed every day. "This is the Rodriguez family from San Antonio." Kennedy began, his voice heavy with moral weight. "Maria Rodriguez worked 2 jobs to support her children while her husband served in Afghanistan. They saved every penny to send their daughter to college, including small donations to political candidates they believed would fight for working families." Kennedy's voice became more pointed. "Maria's donations went to your campaigns, Madam Speaker. Money she earned cleaning office buildings at night was spent on your luxury vacations and family business ventures." He continued with more examples. "This is James Mitchell from Detroit. He's a retired auto worker whose pension was cut while you were making millions trading on information about automotive industry legislation." This is Sarah Chen from California. She's a small business owner who had to close her restaurant during COVID while you were using taxpayer resources to coordinate your family's investment portfolio. Kennedy's voice reached ultimate moral authority. These are the Americans you betrayed, Madam Speaker. These are the people whose trust you violated, whose money you stole, whose faith in representative government you destroyed through your systematic corruption. The accumulated weight of evidence, moral condemnation, and constitutional judgment finally broke what remained of Nancy Pelosi's political composure. The woman who had dominated American politics for decades began to hyperventilate, clutching the table for support as the reality of her complete exposure sank in. Her expensive attorneys were frantically trying to coordinate some kind of damage control response, but they realized that no amount of legal maneuvering could address the scope of criminal evidence that had been presented. Social media exploded with hashtags that told the story of constitutional justice finally delivered. Pelosi exposed, hashtag Kennedy hero, hashtag constitutional, justice, and drain. Swamp dominated trending topics worldwide with unprecedented engagement numbers that crashed Twitter's servers. Pelosi was unable to respond coherently to the evidence, her decades of political experience completely inadequate to address the systematic constitutional case that Kennedy had built against her. Kennedy stood for his final words, holding his pocket constitution like a sacred text that had been vindicated against decades of political corruption. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kennedy said, his voice carrying the satisfied authority of someone who had delivered constitutional justice. "What we've witnessed here today is what accountability looks like when someone finally has the courage to hold corrupt politicians responsible for their crimes." The chamber erupted in a standing ovation that lasted over 20 minutes as Americans across the country watched constitutional principles triumph over political corruption. Gallery members, C-SPAN viewers, and social media audiences witnessed a moment of political justice that restored faith in American institutions. "In America, no one is above the law," Kennedy continued as the applause continued. "Not even San Francisco royalty who think their political power makes them untouchable. Not even politicians who believe they can steal from the American people without consequences." Kennedy calmly packed his briefcase as the ovation continued, his demeanor that of someone who had simply done his constitutional duty rather than delivered one of the most devastating political destructions in American history. "The Constitution still works when constitutional scholars have the courage to defend it," Kennedy said in his closing words. "Class dismissed, Madam Speaker." As Kennedy walked out of the chamber, Nancy Pelosi sat motionless. Her political career effectively ended by a Louisiana lawyer who had proven that Southern charm, Oxford education, and constitutional principles could still triumph over decades of Washington corruption. The woman who had wielded power with an iron fist had been brought down by a man with a briefcase full of evidence and an unshakable commitment to constitutional justice. Within minutes of Nancy Pelosi's complete political destruction at the hands of John Kennedy, the American political landscape was forever altered. The footage of the former speaker sitting motionless while a Louisiana constitutional scholar systematically exposed decades of corruption became the most viral political content in Internet history, surpassing 100 million views in its first 24 hours. The video clips of Kennedy's most devastating moments, his Oxford education revealed the insider trading mathematical impossibility, the constitutional oath recitation, and his final moral reckoning, were shared across every social media platform with engagement numbers that broke previous records for political content. CNN and MSNBC, longtime Pelosi allies who had spent years defending her against corruption allegations, found themselves in an impossible position. The evidence Kennedy had presented was so comprehensive, so well-documented, and so legally devastating that even the most partisan commentators couldn't dismiss it as political theater. This represents perhaps the most thorough exposure of political corruption in modern American history, Anderson Cooper acknowledged during emergency coverage. The evidence presented by Senator Kennedy appears irrefutable and demonstrates a level of systematic abuse that threatens public faith in representative government. Democratic Party leadership went into complete crisis mode as the implications of Pelosi's exposure spread throughout their ranks. If the party's most powerful leader had been systematically corrupt for decades, how many other Democratic politicians might be similarly compromised? Emergency meetings were called as party officials realized that Pelosi's corruption was so extensive, so well documented, that any attempts to defend her would destroy their own credibility. Within 48 hours, every major Democratic leader had issued statements distancing themselves from Pelosi and calling for complete accountability for any violations of public trust. Chuck Schumer announced his immediate resignation from Senate leadership, stating, "I can no longer serve in leadership when I fail to detect such systematic constitutional violations within our own party." His resignation triggered a complete reshuffling of Democratic power structures as younger politicians scrambled to avoid association with the Pelosi corruption scandals. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who had built her career partly in opposition to establishment Democrats like Pelosi, issued a statement that would define progressive politics for the next decade. This exposure proves that corruption exists across party lines and that progressives must lead the fight for genuine accountability regardless of political affiliation. Senator John Kennedy's approval rating soared to heights never before recorded in modern American polling. Within 72 hours of the hearing, his approval rating reached 89% nationally, including 67% approval among registered Democrats who recognized the constitutional principles he had defended. Kennedy for President movement spontaneously erupted across the country with organizational capabilities that surprised even seasoned political observers. Rally organizers reported venues selling out within minutes of announcing Kennedy appearances, with waiting lists stretching into tens of thousands. Constitutional law schools across America immediately began incorporating Kennedy's systematic destruction of Pelosi into their curricula as the gold standard for constitutional accountability and legal argumentation. Harvard Law School announced the creation of the Kennedy Constitutional Advocacy Fellowship to train future lawyers in the methodical approach he had demonstrated. Kennedy himself remained characteristically humble about his role in exposing the corruption. During a press conference at the Louisiana State Capitol, his response to presidential speculation captured the constitutional principles that had made him a national hero. "I didn't do this for political advancement. I did it because the Constitution demands that we hold all government officials accountable to their oath of office, regardless of their party, their power, or their political connections." Publishers immediately began bidding wars for Kennedy's account of the investigation, with the winning bid of $45 million being donated entirely to establish the Constitutional Accountability Foundation to support investigations into government corruption and provide legal defense for whistleblowers. Nancy Pelosi's political career, which had spanned over 3 decades and included historic achievements as the first female Speaker of the House, was effectively ended in a single hearing. Within a week, she had resigned from all committee positions, lost her Speaker Emerita title, and faced calls for expulsion from Congress. The Pelosi family's business empire, built on decades of insider trading and political corruption, began to collapse as government contracts were canceled, business partners fled, and federal investigations were launched into every aspect of their financial operations. Paul Pelosi, facing potential federal charges for campaign finance violations and money laundering, hired criminal defense attorneys and reportedly began cooperation discussions with federal prosecutors to avoid decades in prison. The mansion that had symbolized Pelosi's power and wealth became a symbol of political corruption as protesters gathered daily outside its gates. Local San Francisco officials, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, began removing Pelosi's name from streets and public buildings that had been named in her honor. Kennedy's systematic exposure of Pelosi's corruption triggered the largest congressional investigation in American history. Within 2 weeks, Special Prosecutor John Durham announced simultaneous investigations into 37 members of Congress who had demonstrated similar patterns of suspicious trading activity or financial irregularities. The Securities and Exchange Commission announced new enforcement protocols specifically designed to detect congressional insider trading, while the Federal Election Commission began auditing every major political figure who had shown unusual wealth accumulation relative to their government salary. Most significantly, Congress passed the Kennedy Constitutional Accountability Act, with overwhelming bipartisan support establishing permanent mechanisms for investigating government corruption and requiring real-time disclosure of all financial activities by federal officials and their families. Public trust in constitutional government, which had reached historic lows before Kennedy's investigation, began to be restored as Americans witnessed that accountability was still possible when principled leaders had the courage to defend constitutional principles against political corruption. 6 months after the hearing that saved American democracy from systematic corruption, Kennedy was invited to address a joint session of Congress. His speech, watched by over 250 million Americans, became known as the Constitutional Restoration Address and defined American political discourse for a generation. My fellow Americans, Kennedy concluded that historic evening, his Louisiana drawl carrying across the chamber where he had delivered constitutional justice. What we learned from exposing political corruption is that the Constitution works exactly as the founders intended. When government officials betray their oath, when they steal from the people they were sworn to serve, the Constitution provides the tools to hold them accountable. The price of constitutional liberty is eternal vigilance. He continued, quoting the founders who had designed the system he had just used to deliver justice. Sometimes that vigilance requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about people we trusted with power. But that's the responsibility of citizenship in a constitutional republic. As for Nancy Pelosi, she was convicted on multiple federal charges, including insider trading, campaign finance violations, and money laundering. Her sentence of 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole served as a warning to every politician who might consider using public office for personal enrichment. The woman who had wielded an iron fist in a Gucci glove spent her remaining years in federal prison, a forgotten symbol of corruption whose name became synonymous with the ultimate betrayal of public trust. But Kennedy's constitutional legacy lived on. The Louisiana scholar who had defended the Constitution against domestic enemies became a symbol of what America could be when principled leaders had the courage to hold government accountable to its founding principles. Constitutional justice had been served, truth had prevailed over corruption, and America was reminded that the Constitution still works when constitutional scholars have the courage to defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Smash that. Like if constitutional justice was served, subscribe for more constitutional truth that exposes Washington corruption. Hit that bell, because when real constitutional scholars defend America, freedom wins. The constitutional republic the founders created had survived its greatest test of corruption, and John Kennedy had proved that in America, no one, absolutely no one, is above the Constitution.